Welcome everybody to the Art of Tumbao podcast. My name is Musa with Social Dance Mastery, and this podcast is all about helping social dancers understand the many different expressions of Afro-diasporic social dance. And not just the steps, but also understanding the rhythms, the culture, and the energy behind the movements. In this episode, the topic that we're going to cover is a topic that almost every salsa dancer has encountered but might not understand the root of. This is on-one salsa timing. Now, this is a very important topic because on-one timing has become the standard for salsa in a lot of places around the world. It's usually what people learn first, it's usually what many studios teach, and it's usually what people think salsa is. But the truth is, on-one timing isn't where salsa timing started. And if you don't understand where it came from, it can really limit your growth as a social dancer. So in this episode, we're gonna break all of this down so you can really understand the time step of on-one salsa timing. One of the main things that I help dancers with as a movement coach is their timing. And timing can get tricky, not because it's complicated, but because the way that people are taught timing creates a lot of confusion. And I've learned that before even teaching someone steps, I really have to help them unlearn what they think timing is. And this is true because most dancers come in with fear around timing, or an intimidation of musicality, or a lot of unanswered questions about timing. Now, when it comes to salsa and social dancing, a lot of these questions can be, well, why is timba and salsa caleña on one? Or what's the difference between on-one timing and on-two timing? Or what songs are better for on-one timing as opposed to on-two timing? And a lot of these questions can be very difficult to answer if you don't understand the history of the time steps in salsa. One of the best things to understand about timing in general is that it's not just about stepping on the numbers. Right? Timing is more than that. Timing is about rhythm, it's about history, it's about embodiment, it's about body mechanics. One of the three most important things to really consider with salsa timing is you want to know where the time step comes from. You really want to know what rhythm drives that time step. And you really want to know the body mechanics that make that movement authentic. There is a learning curve to salsa dancing because of these concepts of timing. And to really get into timing, to really be able to embody it, you really have to immerse yourself into the music, into the culture, in order to really get into the feel and essence of these time steps. And in a way, this can be a very great thing to be able to have that breakthrough and get into something on a deeper level. Now, if you have trouble with salsa timing, I want to share with you a personal story of mine as well, because I was there too. I learned salsa in the standard way of 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. And my story about how I transformed and broke through that standardization really comes from my travels to Cuba. And I document this story in my newest book, Social Dance Dynamics, where I talk about my first travels to Cuba and how I encountered the contratiempo style of timing that they would do in Cuba. And this is a type of timing that didn't emphasize the downbeat, like it's very prevalent in the United States. This is the type of timing that emphasizes the offbeats. It's a type of timing that is syncopated. And it's a type of timing that they use in many different dances in Cuba, such as son, danzón, mambo, cha-cha-cha. Now, when I encountered this in Cuba, I realized something. The 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 method was something that only showed me a piece of the full picture. It didn't show me the full picture. It didn't help me understand why different timings exist, where they come from, how to identify different rhythmic instruments to help me stay in tune and in sync with the song. It didn't show me that, right? And this is what led me on the journey to really understanding salsa timing and to help other people with their timing journey, because once your timing clicks into place, it adds a completely new level to your social dance experience. Okay, so let's talk about on-one timing, because on-one timing has become the default entry point for many salsa dancers. And although this makes it more accommodating, there is a big issue to this because it really limits the understanding of what salsa timing is. Now, the big key here is that I want you to understand how On1 became the standardization of salsa timing. Because when we really understand that, we get to something deeper. We start to understand that On1 timing didn't come from the music, it came from the need to teach the music. Now, before we get into the history of On1 timing, let's really set the stage so we can see the context through which On1 started to come out of. And to do this, we really have to focus on Cuba in a specific time frame, in the time frame of the 1940s and 1950s. Remember, in this time in Cuba, you have many different contratiempo styles of dance, such as son, danzón, and mambo, and cha-cha-cha. These dances were done in a contratiempo timing, meaning emphasizing the offbeats and breaking on the second beat, right? But now, as these dances started to develop a new audience in this time frame in the 1940s and 1950s in Cuba, you have to remember this is before the Cuban Revolution and what was going on in Cuba at the time. This was the fat cow time in Cuba. There was a lot of activity in Cuba. You can even consider Cuba to have been the Las Vegas of the New World. Why? Because there was a lot of new people coming into the island. This was a place that had a lot of entertainment. They had casinos. The US had a lot of interest in Cuba at the time, specifically in Havana. This time in Cuba was a time where new audiences were starting to consume Afro-Cuban music. This was a dilemma that a lot of Cuban bands started to encounter as a lot of new audiences started to flow into Havana. These bands realized that some of these new audiences, the dancers, found it hard to connect to the contratiempo timing of danzón and the syncopated rhythms of mambo. They found it a harder time to connect and dance and move to these rhythms and this timing. They needed to simplify the music in a way to help accommodate this new group of audience that were listening to their music. So because of all the changes happening in Havana at the time, the music started to evolve. And one of these evolutions has to do with the formal way that danzón was played. In groups such as Antonio Arcaño and sus Maravillas, they started to shift the formal way danzón was played, and they started to make something called danzón mambo. This was a new version of danzón that added a new section to the danzón that had a little bit more movement, a little bit more energy. Now, out of this group, Antonio Arcaño and su Maravilla, came a person that would revolutionize the way Cuban music was played at the time by creating a new genre out of the danzón mambo called cha-cha-cha. And this was created by Enrique Jorrín. Cha-cha-cha would end up becoming so infectious that it traveled all around the world, from Mexico to Europe and eventually to New York. But here's what made the cha-cha-cha so infectious, and here's the secret ingredient that Enrique Jorrín added and changed from the danzón to make a bigger audience be able to consume the music. To really understand this, we have to focus in on some specific instrumental tumbaos within the ensemble of the time. Now remember, the ensemble that Enrique Jorrín was in was called a charanga. And in the charangas, these were bands that included flutes, violins, as well as Afro-Cuban instruments. Now, one of the main instruments that we want to focus in on when it comes to the evolution from the danzón mambo, into the cha-cha-cha is what's happening with the timbale player, the person that plays the pailas or the timbales, right? Now let's focus in on that rhythm. Now, originally in the classic danzón, the timbale player would play a rhythm called the baqueteo. Now, the baqueteo was a heavily syncopated rhythm that came from much deeper roots, going back even to some Haitian influences when it comes to that rhythm. Now, one of the key adjustments that was made in cha-cha-cha was what the player of the timbales was doing. The timbale player had to change what he was doing. He changed from the baqueteo into a much more straight rhythm, a rhythm that hit every quarter note, a rhythm that emphasized the downbeat. When we listen to what the cha-cha-cha rhythm is played on the timbales, we can hear this very clearly, and it's played on the timbale bell. So as you can see and hear, this transition from a much more syncopated baqueteo rhythm to a much more simplified, non-syncopated bell rhythm, what this does for the new audiences and how this helps these new audiences really connect straight into the music. We have to remember that these audiences, the new audience coming into Havana, a lot of the audiences were coming from the United States, and the music in the United States at that time heavily emphasized the downbeat. A lot of the music that was happening, that was going on in the 40s and 50s in the United States, if you listen to that music, you can see a common identifier of the downbeat being emphasized consistently. So when the people in Cuba, such as Enrique Jorin, started to adjust from their more syncopated contratiempo type of dancing and rhythms into that more simplified, just straight on the quarter notes, you can see how this helped a lot of people feel like they can get into the dance better, and they feel like they can express and communicate with the music in a much easier way. It helped these new audiences to consume the music in a better way. This simplification in Cuban music done by people like Enrique Jorin is what led to the popularity of cha-cha-cha and how cha-cha-cha spread all around the world. But in Cuba, in the context where cha-cha-cha was born, the dancers were still dancing contratiempo to cha-cha-cha music. It's when cha-cha-cha started to be taken outside of its context that the timing and how it was approached started to be shifted to the first beat. And this was how cha-cha-cha was counted outside of the context of Cuba. A Cuban dancer counted cha-cha-cha in a completely different way than how dancers were counting it outside of the context. The Cuban dancers listened specifically to the instrumental tumbaos, and that helped them to know when to start their time step. So for a Cuban dancer, the cha-cha-cha actually started on a pickup note. And this means that it started before the measure. This was the 4-and-1, and this represented the cha-cha-cha shuffle step, right? This is where the time step started, on the 4-and-1. Now this is emblematic of a lot of the other dances at the time, such as son and danzón. They started on that same pickup note. Son did it, as well as danzón, as well as mambo. Now the change happens when, outside of the context of Cuba, how people started to perceive when this time step started. They started to shift it from 4-and-1 to starting right on 1, and how it sounded was 1, 2, cha-cha-cha, 1, 2, cha-cha-cha. Now the interesting thing about this is when you shift it from 4-and-1 to 1, 2, cha-cha-cha, this disconnects you from the actual instrumental tumbao of, say, the bass as well as the conga drum. So this creates sort of a dissonance in a sense, but it also creates a resonance in that, because the cha-cha-cha now emphasizes with the bell those first, second, third, and fourth beats. Now you have the ability to connect to the downbeat with the time step if you're counting it 1, 2, cha-cha-cha. So basically there's something that you lose when you count on 1 to cha-cha-cha, but there's also something that resonates, because cha-cha-cha actually changes its emphasis from syncopated offbeats to non-syncopated downbeats. And you can see the evolution of this even today when you go out to a modern social. If a cha-cha-cha song comes on, I want you to look at the crowd and watch how many people are actually dancing on the 4-and-1, as opposed to how many people are dancing on the 1, 2, cha-cha-cha. You can see a lot of people tend to lean more towards that first beat count of cha-cha-cha. Now I'm gonna put on a video so you can see how people have been actually teaching cha-cha-cha, how sometimes people will emphasize the one first when counting cha-cha-cha. This has been the standard, this is part of the standardization of how one became the salsa time step.
The dance should be started by taking a step on the first beat of the bar of the music. So it is one. Yes? 1, 2, 3. A cha-cha, 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 1, 2, 3. So I start with a 1 as the beginning. If I start with 2, 3, 4, and 1, then 1 is my ending, and 2 is the beginning.
Another interesting thing to note is that during this time in the 50s, a new dance in Cuba started to develop called Rueda de Casino. And in this dance, if you notice, Rueda de Casino is danced on one, as well as the modern timba in Cuba that we know today is also danced in one. Why are these dances danced on one as well? If we look deep into it, Rueda de Casino was heavily influenced by the rock and roll that was starting to come into Havana through the US influence. Remember, rock and roll was coming up in the late 40s and 50s in the United States, and it heavily emphasized the downbeats. And this started to infiltrate into Cuba as well. And this is how we get Rueda de Casino dance on one. Also, timba started to incorporate elements from US music, such as the drum set. Now, because of this exchange between the United States and Cuba, and specifically New York, a lot of Cuban musicians would move to New York. People like Machito, people like Mario Balsa, and they would intertwine with the jazz scene that was happening in New York at the time. This combination of Afro-Cuban music and jazz would create a new era in New York, which would start to coalesce in the Palladium Ballroom. And in the Palladium Ballroom, the time step was more original to the Afro-Cuban time steps, the contratiempo time steps. The mambo that was danced in the Palladium had the same 4-1 essence, the contratiempo essence. But as that mambo golden age era started to die out and people wanted to learn more, but it's important to remember that in the Palladium Ballroom, we're still dealing with a context outside of Cuba. And this is a group of people that wanted to learn how to dance to these rhythms. And the teachers that instructed these people found something very interesting. They found it very difficult to teach people how to dance to syncopated rhythms because people were so used to hearing those downbeats in the music that was all around them in the United States. This is what made it a little difficult for instructors to teach the on-two timing that was essential for the mambo contratiempo time step. And this is where the second adjustment started to happen in this era after the Palladium Ballroom mambo golden age era of salsa. We started to get into the real standardization of the on-one time step that we know today because of the frustration and the confusion that happens when people so used to non-syncopated music start listening to syncopated music. Now, in the late 60s, as the term salsa starts to come up, the commercialization of salsa and salsa spreads all around the world, we really see that on-one time step really being focused on. But one person, Eddie Torres, really helped to bring back the essence of the mambo time step while still accommodating people who might have trouble listening to syncopated rhythms. He did this by a hybridized type of time step that we now call the modern on-two time step. And what he did basically is he broke on the one and then still marked the one, but still broke on the two. And what he did was he marked the one in the time step, but still broke on the two. And this is very interesting because this is exactly what happened with cha-cha-cha back in the 50s and how people started to count cha-cha-cha on one for the convenience and accessibility. Now, when we get to the Eddie Torres count, we see that this gives a hybridized sense of feeling and it makes it accessible for people because they're they're marking on what seems like a 1 count, but they're also breaking on the 2 count. And this is sort of how we get that hybridized modern on-2 time step that we see today. Now, just as a brief side note, we want to look at salsa caleña nowadays, salsa in Colombia. And you notice how salsa in Colombia has an on-1 time step. Why is salsa in Colombia danced on 1? Well, it has to do with the time that salsa in Colombia started to begin. Remember, salsa in Colombia started in the time frame of the 60s and the 70s. This was during the time of the commercialization of salsa, the time where the standardization of the on-1 time step was starting to come into full effect. So you can see how when it started to move to Colombia, how that time step started to be adopted over in Colombia as well, even though some of the original contratiempo time steps were not so prevalent in this time. So now that you have more information about the origins of the on-1 time step, the key to remember here is that on-1 timing is not wrong. It's just that if you only learn on-1 timing, if you only stay in the realm of on-1 salsa timing, then it would be incomplete. So if you want to go deeper into these concepts of timing and really get a good understanding, we have many different courses and resources in our online community, Social Dance Mastery. So I encourage everyone to join the community and check out what we're doing. It's free to join. We have many different courses and resources for dancers who want to build their rhythm, who want to build their connection, who really want to grow in their skill level when it comes to the many different kinds of Afro-Latin social dances. So thank you for listening to this episode of the Art of Tumbao, and I'll see you there.